to everyone. My name is Thomas Steyert. I'm working for an executive agency set up by the European Commission to support the activities of the Enterprise Europe Network. Welcome to today's webinar dealing on US employment and human resources rules and regulations. For those of you who have not heard about the Enterprise Europe Network, please allow me to briefly introduce what we are doing. We are quite huge, I would say. I think, modestly speaking, we are one of the biggest business support networks in the world, platforms in the world. So we are offering a wealth of services, including internationalization services, helping companies to find business partners abroad, also to make most out of free trade agreements established between the European Union and other trade blocs. Innovation is also at the heart of the Enterprise Europe Network service portfolio. We are offering technology transfer services. We're helping companies to safeguard their intellectual property, and we are helping companies to engage in bilateral research and development cooperation, but also via the main European research and innovation programs such as Horizon Europe or Eureka. We are helping to make companies more resilient. We're helping companies also to adopt more sustainable business models. And of course, we help companies to navigate the complexities of the European single markets, including their legislation and industrial rules and regulations. If you're interested in services from the Enterprise Europe Network, feel free reaching out to us. Just enter or visit our public website, Enterprise Europe Network, and you have a drop-down list of local contact points you can get in touch with and ask for support. But now I would like to put the focus on today's webinar, Doing Business in the United States, what you need to know about US employment and human resources, rules and regulations. So in a nutshell, and Fernanda will tell you more about the content of today's webinar in a few seconds. In a nutshell, we'll be dealing with US employment rules and regulations, and also we'll have a look or get a deeper insight on the US workplace ethic or workplace culture, I would say. But that's it from me. I would now hand over the floor to Fernanda, the Executive Director of the European American Chamber of Commerce in the Carolinas. Fernanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Good morning from the US, everybody. My name is Fernanda Cheva. I am the Executive Director of the European American Chamber of Commerce in the Carolinas. We are the official partners of the EN in the US, and this is our last webinar of the year. I would like to ask you all, if you have any questions, just to write them on the chat. We're going to make sure to answer all of that. Even if the time is over, we are going to reach out to you. If you want to have the questions, just send us an email with your address, and we're going to be happy to answer any questions that you might have. I would also like to give you some heads up about a new program that we developed. If you're interested in accessing the US market, we now have a program called the Navigator, and we help the companies, especially European companies, interested in coming over to the US. And it is more than a soft landing program. That's a guided landing program. If you're interested, please contact us using the email that you're seeing above or through Thomas. And we are going to be happy to explain you how that works, how can we help you make the right decisions, use the right strategy, and we can connect you with all the right people. Some of them you're going to get to know today in this webinar. And these are the experts that we work with for this program. Now I'm going to pass the word to our moderator of the day, Cecilia, and I wish you all a good webinar.
Thank you, Fernanda. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our, as Fernanda had mentioned, our last webinar for the year, but I'm sure there'll be more upcoming in 2025. Brief introduction. My name is Cecilia. I'm the CEO of Palmetto Innovasphere, which is a life science and biotechnology institute here in South Carolina. And what I'd like to do is actually ask our panels to briefly introduce themselves. And then from there, we will go through some specific topics and key questions. Now, this is a very, very in-depth conversation. We may not get to all the answers with some of the questions, as Fernanda has said, but we will try and answer them throughout. So let's start in introducing our panel members here. Catherine Busby, can you start, please?
Sure. My name is Catherine Busby. I'm an employment attorney at Hainsworth Sinclair Boyd. So our law firm is a full service law firm, and we are located in the Carolinas. I'm specifically in South Carolina, but we help clients all over the country, and we worked with a lot of European clients who are locating in the US. So yeah, I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ashley? Ashley?
Hi, I'm Ashley Cutno. I'm also an employment attorney. I work with Ogletree Deakins. We are one of the largest employment law firms in the world. We have offices in 52 states in the United States, as well as offices in Europe. And we work again with different European companies, companies all over the US on their employment specific matters.
Thank you, Ashley. And Lisa?
So my name is Lisa Patty, and I have a company called C3 Speech. And what I do is I coach international founders and executives when they launch into the US on communication style, on interactions they might encounter, their pitch decks, anything that they might need to pivot a little bit when they enter the US market.
Thank you and welcome. All right, let's get started. We have about 45 minutes to kind of go over a few things and then give us a little time for some Q&A. I'll start with Catherine, actually. How about covering navigating the U.S. legal environment and employment regulations? And one of the questions really is, how are employment laws set up in the U.S. and do they differ by location?
So sure, and yes, they do differ by location. So here in the US, we have federal employment laws that apply to all of the US, but then we also have state employment laws. So where you locate in the US really matters for what employment laws you're going to be subject to, what regulations. And so there are states that are a little more, I would say overall, the US is much more employer friendly in my experience with working with European clients. We have less employment laws than typical in Europe, but some states are more employee friendly. So if you're locating in places like California, Colorado, Washington, New York, there are some states that have more employment laws that you are going to be subject to. Here in South Carolina and in the Carolinas and the Southeast in general, I think is a little more employer friendly. We don't have as many employment laws you have to comply with, but yes, it does matter where you locate. There are state specific laws as well.
What are the things that employers or companies need to prepare for as they sort of get through and navigate through coming in through the U.S.?
So, there are certain agreements and certain documents that we always recommend that you have in place when you're locating here in the U.S. Once you've chosen a location and, you've set up a contact with an employment attorney, hopefully in that state, to give you some guidance and counsel, there are some things that we recommend that you have in place. And so, the first is an offer letter. So a lot of the European clients we've worked with, they are always surprised to learn that, employment agreements are not used as ubiquitously here in America as in Europe. We use offer letters more commonly here. So usually employment agreements are reserved for more higher level positions. Sometimes your mid-level positions, and it kind of depends by industry, but you want to have an offer letter in place that basically lays out the terms of the employment. that has at will language here. That's a term here in the US, and a lot of you may be familiar with that. That basically says, you can be terminated at any time for any reason without prior notice. And so we always have a paragraph in there of at will employment that gives the employer a lot of flexibility. And so in conjunction with your offer letter, a lot of times you want to have a good confidentiality agreement as well, a non-solicitation agreement maybe too, depending on your industry. And so if you have an employment agreement for your higher level employees, sometimes those terms will be in there. But for your employees that just have offer letters, a good confidentiality agreement is good to have in place as well. You also want to have some employer policies in place, and usually those are contained in a handbook, an employee handbook. So, you give that a handbook to everyone in their onboarding when they're starting with the company, and they're going to sign an acknowledgement that says, I'm aware of all the policies in this handbook. I agree to comply with these policies. And that's going to keep you in compliance with a lot of U.S. federal employment laws and state laws where you're operating. And the other one I'll throw out there, and I know Ashley probably will want to piggyback on this too, but your job descriptions. You want to have job descriptions in place for every position. Those are very important, that you're clearly listing the essential functions of that job, because there are certain employment laws in the U.S. That you can terminate or demote or make certain decisions, but you need to do it based on what's in that job description. So that job description is very important.
Would there be like resources for companies to, my own experience in running a different company at the very beginning was these employee or handbooks. It requires some due diligence, right, across the board, right, Catherine? But there are resources that most companies can go to.
Yes, there are resources, and we always, of course, recommend that you let your employment attorney review and revise your handbook. We have clients that kind of put together a base handbook, and then they'll send it to us, and we make sure it's compliant legally. But SHRM is also a good resource for a lot of people, society, for human resource managers, that you can get template documents from. But we do always recommend that you have employment counsel look at those, because there are certain laws that only apply to employers if you have so many employees. If you have 15 employees, certain laws are going to apply. If you have 50 employees, certain laws. And so you don't want things in your handbook that you don't actually have to be subject to. But yes, there are some good resources out there as well.
That's great. You also mentioned at-will laws out there. Not all the states have that. Is that correct?
Not all states are necessarily have at-will employment. But I think it's pretty, I would say a lot of states do. And I think this is a question that comes up for a lot of employers even. I'm in an at-will state. I've got my at-will disclaimer in my offer letter and in my handbook. Why can't I just actually fire people for no reason? And, we always have to walk them through that there are a lot of employment laws here in the US that you still have to comply with. And when you terminate someone for no reason, you don't communicate a reason, that employee is going to fill in the gap, and they're going to feel like they're terminated because of a protected class or something that violates the law. So even if you're in an at-will state, even if you have those disclaimers, you still have to be very careful in making sure you're carrying out, that hiring and termination correctly.
Yeah, that's great. Those are great points, which actually is a nice segue, moving right into Ashley to talk about compliance, hiring, and termination practices. And one of the questions was that what are the key employment rules to know regarding hiring, and then kind of piggyback off of some of those at-will laws and termination requirements and documentation. Ashley, can you elaborate more?
Sure. So let's start with hiring. So with hiring, as Katie said, we have both federal laws and we have state laws. So when we talk about the federal laws that would apply to everywhere, one of the things that you want to be very aware of is many employers in the US run background checks on folks before they will bring them into their organization, there are very, very specific rules around background checks. You can't just get a resume and run a background check. You have to really follow some very specific rules. So it's really important to understand that in the very beginning and on the forefront. We also have multiple states now that are requiring there to be disclosure of salary bands and what that job position will require for a salary band. As we are coming out of COVID and we have more and more remote workers, those laws are getting more complicated because many states say if the person could work remotely, they still will fall under the state's requirements for disclosure of the salary band. That is an unusual and fairly new concept here in the US, especially in most states. That is new and different and is not required everywhere. So again, it really depends on where you are locating. And again, like Katie said, once you interview, once you get someone on board, it's also very important to have a really strong offer letter with that at will language everywhere that you can have it. That really gives companies a lot of protection to bring people on at will because it gives you a lot more flexibility in your termination. I will say one thing to be aware of. There are also really specific rules if you have anyone who applies who may have a disability. There are rules about when you can ask about the disability and whether or not they're able to actually perform the essential functions of the job. So that's important to understand. It's also important to understand when you can do things like a drug screen or when you can ask certain questions to a person. There are also questions that you cannot ask in the US during an interview. Those have to do with what we call our protected classes. And I know Katie used that term before, but our protected classes in the US are sex, gender, religion, disability status, those types of things. Your race is one. So not asking incorrect questions on the actual application forms is also something that's really important in the US. You can ask most of the questions, but it's about the timing of the asking as far as when you can do things. And that becomes very important with hiring. I'm not going to take up all of our time with this comment with hiring, but I do want to mention it. So we are talking about European companies because this is an entire webinar of its own. But when you're talking about bringing folks over from Europe in our immigration processes, it's very important to not only understand our immigration process, but also to understand the timing of our immigration process, because the runway and the timing to bring folks over is much longer than I think people initially think it will be. And right now, with our change in the administration, there's a lot of unknowns about what's going to immigration is going to look like for the next 4 years. The last time that Trump was in office, he made pretty substantial changes to the immigration process. So we are all kind of waiting on pins and needles to see what that's going to look like this time around. But it's definitely something to be aware of and to make sure you have a good immigration lawyer on your team from the very beginning if you're talking about bringing people over to the US. And again, I think the biggest piece of that that folks don't understand is the timing and the restrictions around that. But the timing is the biggest one that I think catches folks off guard. So those are kind of my biggest pieces about hiring. Now, when we turn our attention to termination, it really depends. Again, as Katie said, if you're in an at-will state, you can terminate for any reason, good reason, bad reason, as long as it's not a protected reason. So basically that means you can't discriminate against someone and fire them because they're in a protected class. You can terminate me because I'm just not doing a good job. You can terminate me because I'm just not a good fit. You can terminate me because it's just not working out. However, you cannot terminate me for those protected reasons. I'm a female, whatever my race is, disability status, I'm a veteran, my religion, those kinds of reasons You cannot terminate for. So the best way to make sure that you can substantiate the reason for your termination is to document performance problems along the way. And many of our companies here in the US have what we call progressive discipline. So you give a verbal warning, then you give a written warning, then you give a final warning, then you terminate, and all of that is documented. We always have kind of a clause that says those steps can be skipped if the thing that the person does is bad enough, that you can go straight to termination. But that is the way it is in most places. I will say one other thing to keep in mind when you talk about the different states to look at. One very important thing to look at is what your requirements are at termination as far as how quickly you have to pay out the final paycheck, but also do you or do you not have to pay out things like vacation leave. In a handful of states, you do have to pay out accrued leave. In the vast majority of our states, as long as you have a correct policy in place, you do not have to pay out that kind of unused leave. It's based on the policy the company chooses, not based on the state law. And that can have real financial consequence for large companies in certain states that are more generous with their leave policies, which we often see with with European companies. That's something that surprises folks. So those are kind of some of the key points I would say having to do with hiring and with termination.
Thank you, Ashley. You brought up a great point. I think both you and Katie did as well. The employee handbook should have these information in there so that the employee understands that these are the policies and these are the guidelines and laws that we follow as a company, especially when you have a termination issue or compensation questions. That's correct.
That's right. And in fact, I would say the handbook is really the most important document that you have. And I think it is the most important document for you to have before you hire your very first employee in the US, is to have your handbook ready, laid out, and available. It is basically our rules of the road for your company. It has all of the policies, all of the rules, the expectations. And so it really is the guiding document, not only for your employees, but also for your supervisors and your management as they are managing the people who are working in the US. So it really is a critical document for companies to have and to have correct. And it's really usually somewhat of a living document. Most of our companies do a handbook check every year or every 2 years to make sure a law hasn't changed or that they're not wanting to change a policy because of the operational changes that they've had. And so it is something of an evergreen document that does change and can be changed. You're not locking yourself in at the very beginning, but it's really critical to have that document in place really before you hire your very first employee in the US.
Which actually is a great segue to the other question on the front end. What are those things, in addition to the employee handbook, what are those things that a company from abroad wanting to operate in the US, what are the front end tasks that they need to have in place? And let's have Katie answer first and then go back to Ashley.
Yeah, so I kind of piggybacking on what I said earlier, we talked about some documents that you want to have in place, and you want to be aware of too. Again, like I said, employment laws can differ by how many employees you have. So you really need to be aware of, okay, how many people am I hiring? How many am I going to be hiring within the next couple of years? You need to kind of be forecasting, am I going to be crossing some of these thresholds that's going to put me under certain employment laws? If you're hiring 50 or more people in the US, you're subject to pretty much everything in the US. If you're under 15, you're not subject to a lot of federal employment laws. You are subject to some. So you kind of have to know what your ramp up is going to be in the US. We talked about those documents you want to have in place. Yes, the handbook's very important. And it's important that they're signing that acknowledgement, that employee saying, I recognize this is the handbook, I'm going to comply with it, and that you're putting that acknowledgement in their personnel file. So if there is an issue down the road and they say, oh, I didn't know I had to do X, Y, and Z. Why am I being terminated for this? You can pull that out and say, yes, you did know. You signed this handbook acknowledgement. And, those agreements that are in place, especially if you have, it depends what kind of industry you're in, but if you have a lot of intellectual property, things like that, you want some agreements in place to protect that. And so you want to be thinking about those things. Who are we as a company? What's important to us? How quickly are we looking to ramp up in the US? And making sure you're preparing for that.
Ashley?
Yes, agree with everything Katie said. In addition, I would say probably, and this is not because Katie and I are on this webinar, but really getting in touch with an employment attorney before you ever open so that you can make sure these documents are done correctly is really critical. I think that there are also some great different connector organizations through the EACC and through other organizations that can really help you get a better understanding of the location that you're choosing. Katie and I are both here in Greenville, South Carolina, where we have multiple international organizations. We have a great chamber. Almost everywhere in the US has a great chamber. They have amazing resources. EACC works with chambers all the time, and they can do things like give you an analysis and comparison of wages in the area. So you're both being competitive with other organizations for the talent that you want, and that you know where the kind of the sweet spot is for that kind of stuff. So there are great organizations out there that the EACC can really connect you to and really help you find that kind of information and those different types of things. We've got lots of connections through EACC that can really help with that. And really understanding your true location where you're going in is important, and those local connections are critical to that.
That's great. Thank you for that. And thank you for the reminder on the chamber and resources, because that's actually a very good resource for a lot of the companies coming in. So we've gone through the compliance, we've gone through US laws, we've gone through all the documents that needs to be prepared prior to operating in the US. Now we're kind of shifting a little bit and in more of, it's not really what we call touchy-feely, but it's important to understand the differences in working culture in the US as well as communications across the board. So we will have Lisa now talk a little bit more about understanding the US working culture and common challenges as you expand in the US. Lisa?
So, sorry, it really depends, I think, where you're from, what countries you're coming from, how different it's going to be. I actually so I do a lot of coaching with smaller companies, small to mid-sized companies that are launching into the US. Sometimes people have an easier time of it. Sometimes it's really difficult just because of communication styles and, how people tune in, how people listen. So, and also being careful not to get too caught up in the stereotypes of this as well, because I could say these things and then you'll meet people and it will totally blow everything I'm saying away. So just keep in mind, who's sitting in front of you. And first of all, I think it's really important that we all start to think about, okay, what kind of word choices are we actually using? So in the US, we love colloquialisms, we love sports analogies. But, as we're on a team of international people, maybe we're doing an international launch, we just joined an international company, being careful not to really overemphasize those types of things where your colleagues can't necessarily join into that or might not even get it, because there's some really specific, let's say, sports analogies that everybody loves, football, baseball, that not everybody's going to get. Also how specific you are. What I've noticed is, Americans, well, most Americans like to be quite concise and direct. And that's really important in business culture. Now, depending on where you're coming from, once again, a lot of languages are a bit more flowery, a bit longer in the use of vocabulary, and that's how it translates over. Plus, culturally, it's how you set a lot of credibility. You are talking about your pedigree, you're talking about where you went to school, you're talking about before you even get into what you're doing and the why. That could actually put off sometimes, especially American C-suite, because they like to get to the point very quickly. And that's one of those things where process orientation, okay, we have 30 minutes, this is the agenda, could throw off some of your colleagues from abroad until they get used to the style. And again, I think a lot of this has to do with being aware so you can flex, so you can adapt to different styles. Obviously, if you're in a corporation that, has that style, then you're the one that's going to do some of the adapting. But it's also really important for the management or the C-suite, your colleagues, to understand where you're coming from as well. Are you more, from a culture that is going to wait and add in later? And if you're in a meeting like that and everybody's talking and everybody's adding in and it's very fast, and you're waiting to jump in, you don't want to be impolite. That's another big, a big issue for certain people from certain cultures. A lot of Asian companies from Asia have this problem. My Northern European cultures that I train tend to be very direct. And sometimes that directness looks different than, let's say, an American directness. Americans like directness, but I think it has to do more with being concise, right? You break it down. English is easy to, really make concise, but still make an impact. Whereas we'll avoid certain tones, certain ways of giving feedback. And I think that could be really confusing because people will constantly come up to me and say, okay, so I thought Americans were really straightforward, and I can't get a straightforward answer. What is the feedback on this? Or do they really, think I'm doing a good job? I can't understand. How do I even know this? Because everybody keeps saying, oh, I'm doing great. I'm doing so, it was amazing. Those types of words, especially amazing, are words that people, they focus on, but then they start not to believe it. And what I usually tell people is, first of all, the concision is, being concise has to do with breaking it down. So thinking about, how you're going to bullet out your thoughts, how you're going to present your thoughts in the sense of, what I usually tell people is, what are you talking about? And I actually got this from a podcaster and a professor at Stanford. His name is Matt Abrahams, and he has a great podcast. It's called Think Fast, Talk Smart. It's a communication podcast. But if you're an international person coming into the US, it's actually got great tips. And one of the things that he actually gave a tip on is what, so what, now what? And that's a great way to keep your ideas tight. So what are you talking about? So what? So why does it matter? So why do we want to hear this? And now what? So what's your next steps? What did you learn? And that's one way to think about, okay, I'm keeping it tight. I'm keeping it a little more focused on what the person wants to hear. Now, going towards the feedback part, you might want to ask for clarification because let's say someone is from France, and this actually happened to one of my French clients. She was talking to her boss. She had the interpretation that she was doing wonderfully, but unfortunately she didn't read between the lines, but she heard, you're doing amazing. I would love for you to focus on these few things, but you're doing great. And I do think because America is such an entrepreneurial culture, it's not necessarily fakeness, which I think a lot of people misinterpret it as like, oh, I feel like they're not being honest with me or real with me. It's really a way of supporting people. And because, again, of that entrepreneurial mindset, maybe it's, the individualism and how we think about things, people like to encourage you to move ahead. However, for certain cultures that have actually told me, I've been told from bosses in many different places, Okay, you're not doing this well, period, end of story. There's no positive feedback after that. Again, if you flip that and let's say someone from the States is listening to that, they're going to think, oh my gosh, that was incredibly rude. I'm going to be fired. And that's not always the case either. That's probably not the case. But for someone who is in the States, ask for clarification. If you're really not sure where the feedback is, or if you want more critical feedback and you need it to be more clear, you need to ask that. Give specifics. Okay, so I'd really like feedback on this project that I did, especially this part. Can you give me this specific feedback? So those are things that often get confused here in the States. And it is a little bit harder to navigate. And these are nuances, but they make a big difference in how the team is actually working together, how the launch is going, how relationships are being created or not created. So it also adds to the success of your launch as you have your employment laws in place and all the documents in place. It's going to be rough if your team really can't get on the same page and then they start to separate. So those are some of the key points that I usually train people on when I'm thinking about communication and how people start to think in, let's say, a US launch.
That's great. Thank you, Lisa. That was you actually brought up some very, very interesting topics there as well. I know that performance evaluations can be challenging, especially from employees being hired by a different company coming from abroad, but also the marrying of laws and regulations with regard to employee rights, employee benefits, as well as performance evaluations. Any general comments from Ashley and Katie on the working culture and common challenges?
I'll just kind of piggyback a little bit on the evaluations that you hit on. So I know, on the employment law side, something that we run into that's a common problem is, I'll have an employer call and say, we got to terminate this employee, but they're in all of these protected classes, based on their race or they're a female or whatever, but, they're a terrible employee. And so I say, okay, well, send me their personnel file. Let's see what kind of documentation you have. And, they've been an employee for 10 years and they have glowing evaluations. I'm like, well, the reason for termination, the documentation and the evaluations are not matching up with what you're telling me. And so I would say, I do think in the US, like you said, we're always wanting to give positive feedback sometimes, and you can't always be giving, you need to be giving true and accurate feedback. If there are issues with that employee, they need to be in that evaluation. And so, if it does lead up to a point where you have to take an action, there's some accurate documentation there.
Yeah, that's right. Ashley, what about you? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I think this is true whether you're in Europe or in the US, but I think making sure your managers are well trained in how to communicate, but also how to have strong emotional intelligence is important. The way that I may take feedback may be very different from the way that Katie takes feedback. And so to have that emotional intelligence to be able to kind of read the room and how someone is taking feedback, I think is important. And I think when you're talking about international companies coming into the US, making sure that everyone has the same understanding of those cues and the word choice that is used can be really critical. I have a manager we're working with right now. He is fabulous. He is wonderful, but sometimes his word choice is wrong. And so then people hear the wrong message. And so it's the training of that. And it's really a training of your supervisors that can be really critical to making sure you retain a really good culture over here. Because I will say, when you look at US surveys, everybody thinks, oh, it's always about how much money you make and how much money you're paying. But when you really look at US surveys about employment, what you see is that people want to work in a place where they're happy and they feel valued. And that's how you have the best retention. And when you have retention, you have overall lower employment costs.
Yeah, For sure, for sure. Lisa, you may have one last comment.
I was actually going to piggyback on that again and just start to think about, so I love what you just said. You know, we were talking about word choices, and again, I think that goes back to getting everybody on the same page and having those conversations, because like you said, it's very different for everybody. How everybody listens and how everybody perceives is through their own lens of experience. So all the things that I've been through are informing how I listen. You know, where I come from is informing how I listen. Being in New York City is informing how I listen, possibly different from your experiences in North Carolina. So these are things that, and people should know this also when they're coming to the US, the states can act very different culturally as well. And I think people know that, but sometimes it's pretty extreme how we communicate, those little subtle nuances. Everybody is speaking the same language, but the politeness could look different. You know, the introductions can look different. The feedback can look different. In New York, I could say it's a bit more direct. You could get a little more of that honest feedback out of people, especially in certain industries. However, you know, people are still guilty of what you were saying, Katie, is that, you know, you do have to encourage people, I think, to be a bit more straightforward when it comes to feedback. We're good at it with everything else, as far as how things need to be done, when they need to be done. And also thinking about that as well. You know, what are your expectations? Really lay them out, you know, regarding time, regarding, you know, meetings, regarding relationships. What are the expectations? So I think that when people have that understanding of their team, like you said, it helps retention, because one of the biggest issues is that when there is an international launch, retention, it can be very difficult. You know, getting people to buy in can be very difficult, especially when you have multiple cultures working in the same office. So, and that's much harder, even if you have an international employee and you're sending them abroad to the US. A lot of the times they leave because they don't feel like they're fitting in. They're part of the culture. So thousands and thousands of dollars are spent, and a lot of it comes down to communication. A lot of it is stylistic. So like you said, it's not just about the money. It is about how you feel about fitting in, or at least how you see people are trying to embrace that. Exactly what you're doing, Cecilia, that nod, that smile, I'm expecting that. I'm expecting it because I think, okay, you're doing that right now. That means like you get it, you're listening. Some people don't do anything. And that will throw me off constantly. I have people that are like this, and that's fine for them, and it's very culturally acceptable depending on who you're speaking with. However, for me, it's really hard. So I need a little feedback for someone to tell me, okay, it's moving along. I get a cue from Cecilia. I'm going to wrap it up soon, but she's giving me the nods, a little smile, and then we go. When someone doesn't do that, I don't know if you could hear me, if you can't hear me, if I'm on track, if I'm off track, if you're petting the cat. I don't know. I don't know what's happening, especially on Zoom. So, or any kind of, a video channel. And I think it's even more important, just to add a tiny note, these things play out even more on video. We think it doesn't, but when we have international teams on video, it's even harder, because they say we are diminished by about like 30% when we're on video. So our personalities really don't show. We don't see the little nuances, that little smile, maybe little gestures that we feel when you're here. So those are even more exaggerated in this type of medium. So those are my last little few points.
So we have a few minutes. I don't see any questions on the chat, but are there any questions for our panel members? It doesn't look like there are any. Thomas, we can have our last words perhaps, and people can email or still send their questions afterwards too. There is one. The question from Adam: how do you deal with employers looking to offer medical benefits? It is so different from the EU. Katie or Ashley?
Yeah, I'm happy.
Yeah, go ahead, Katie.
I was just going to say, so here in the U.S., if you have 50 or more employees, full-time equivalent employees in the U.S., so that means even if you have part-time employees, they can add up to make one full-time. But if you have 50 or more, you do have to offer health insurance. You have to offer a certain type of plan, a compliant plan with the Affordable Care Act here in the U.S. And typically when you kind of set up shop over here, you know, you can make a connection with a benefits plan company that will put together a compliant package for you that complies with the ACA if you are subject to that law. And they will also walk you through other benefits that are common for employers here. They may not be required, but certainly if you have 50 or more employees, a lot of employers are offering things like short-term disability, long-term disability, life insurance. And, those things aren't required here, but they are common and they are a recruitment tool as well. If you're under 50 employees, you don't have to offer health insurance, but you still can. And that benefits broker can help put together a package for you that's compliant. If you have anything else, Ashley.
No, I think that's a pretty good answer and very clear. What I will say is once you get in touch with an HR person or an employment attorney over here, from our perspective, it's very different than what European companies do, but it's also pretty straightforward over here. You just need to get with the right contacts to help you find the right broker for the coverage and all of that. And so it's not as daunting as it might feel once you just connect with the right resources.
Right. Another question that came up there, what are the main 3 employer rules to think of? What would you suggest? So they heard employer handbook, and then number 2, number 3. Ashley, your thoughts?
Yeah, so one thing, so the employee handbook, it's the collection of all of your rules. So it is the collection of all of your rules, but I would say 2 of the ones that I would be very, very aware of and that can be very company specific are one, so of course your termination policy, you need to have that in there, but the other one would be your attendance policy. So there's a variation of ways to do attendance policies in the US, and it really depends on, are you a manufacturing operation? Are you with someone with more executive employees like a law firm? How you build that attendance policy for those folks can look it can look a myriad of different ways, but that is a very, very important one because it's one of the places where you see the most abuse. So it's really critical to have a really clean and clear attendance policy and to really understand what your options are and what the best options are for the type of employees that you're going to have. And it can be different. So you can have one policy for more your executive employees and one for your manufacturing employees. But to really understand that, I think is critical. And then the other one I'm going to say is actually maybe a little unusual and surprising. Katie might disagree with this one, but I think one that's important to have in today's world in the US has to do with marijuana use. And the reason I say that is because it is one of the areas that is changing the most in the US right now. Until fairly recently, it was illegal to use marijuana everywhere across the board, could not use it. But now we have multiple states that allow you to use marijuana for out of work reasons or for medical reasons. And that is now creeping into all of the states, whether it's legal or not, and really having clear guidelines around that, I think is becoming more important because it's becoming more confusing in the US. So that's why I say it's one that I think is important to have because it's more confusing, especially if you move into the US and you have multiple locations. The policy and the needs can be different in your different locations.
Yeah, great points. I don't see any other question. And I think we're almost at the time anyway to end our panel discussion. Thank you so much, Lisa, Ashley, and Katie, for your time. I think I'll turn it right back to our hosts.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And my colleague Christos has the honor to speak the closing words.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So I'm Christos Skouras. I represent the European Commission DG GROW. I'm in the unit Industrial Forum Alliances and Clusters. Thanks once again, Fernanda from the European American Chamber of Commerce Carolinas, and Cecilia, of course, my colleague Thomas, and the speakers, / panelists, Ashley, Catherine, and Lisa. They gave us very practical, valuable insights and perspectives on employment and human resources in the US. I understand for sure that, I know it already, but also today I understand for sure that the landscape of employment and human resources is quite complex in the US. It can be a challenge for European companies, especially those that really try to expand to the US, and they are often encounter several challenges related to workplace culture. It's quite different, as we heard from the speakers. Certain very, very specific criteria have to be taken into account, which is not necessarily the case in Europe. And if yes, definitely not in all across all EU member states. We can see different management styles, different regulatory compliance. It can be stressful and disappointing for European companies. So I understand that they need to be very ready. They need to be sure. And I think that, again, this webinar today gave us some important tips. I would like to say here that this webinar comes very timely, in a very timely spot, because in the European Commission, we have a new proposal. It's the so-called e-declaration portal for posting workers in the EU. It's a new tool. It aims to streamline the process of declaring posted workers across member states and basically simplify procedures, give more transparency, kind of coordinate compliance, and mainly, and most of all, reduce administrative burdens, which is a very important issue and challenge in the European business ecosystem. I understand that the US employment and HR landscape continues to evolve. There are many diverse factors that are definitely affecting it, like economic conditions, demographics, I don't know, employment trends, teleworking, technology, regulatory specificities. Also, this is something which is very important, that there are businesses that might need to operate in multiple regions, so they need to be aware of the multiple different employment laws. So all this is quite complex. It's very important for companies to be aware of. I don't want to take more time. Again, I would like to thank you very much for your time and congratulate again, and especially because this is the last one of this series of webinars with our US partners. As I have been saying all this time, the webinars with you guys were really, really to the point, really pragmatic, really realistic. They gave very to the point information for the companies. I'm sure they all appreciated it, and I'm sure we are going to have a new series in the future. Thank you again, and also for our audience, and also from my side.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.